morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Biblical Rogues Gallery here on Trinity Radio and streaming. When Deep Calls Deep, I think it's streaming there too. So multiple places to watch. We've got Junior back with us from across the pond. Welcome back, Junior. Glad to have you.
Good to be back after, Romans 9. So, good to be back.
Everyone kind of got bored after Romans. That's all they wanted to hear. And then we got a little spike for Romans 11 a little bit. Who is Israel? And then nobody cares about all that sanctification stuff that we're getting into, except for Nick. Nick cares about it. Amber, how you doing tonight?
Yeah, I care about this is the ethics part. This is the good stuff, man.
Yeah.
I'm doing pretty good. I got to listen to an amazing presentation for the spring conference from the seminary this morning, and my brain is all like lit up with some amazing things to think about and some ideas, and so I'm really looking forward to some of the content on my channel that's going to come out of some of what they were talking about. So that's pretty awesome.
Cool. Nick?
Just pastoral ministry stuff, dissertation stuff, normal stuff, dad stuff, life stuff, normal stuff. Everybody knows.
Right. Before we get started, I do want to shout out Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary that you can find at trinitysem.edu. Go there and learn from the comfort of your own home from professors you've actually heard of at a price that you can afford. So go check that out. If you're ever considering going to seminary, even for a certificate, for a layperson certificate to serve in your local church, go to trinitysem.edu just trinitysem.edu. I don't know if it's /certificates or something. You can check that out, or you can check out our degree programs. Just go to trinitysem.edu, fill out an eval, and someone from our admissions department will get in touch with you. And if you want to support what we're doing at Trinity Radio, you can go to patreon.com/Trinity Radio, I believe. There may or may not be links in the description as Braxton does this. So let's get right into this. This passage seems to have a lot of takes to it. A straightforward reading will make you think that Paul calls for an unqualified, unyielding, absolute loyalty to the government. Some people say, yep, get over it. And other people say, nope, not quite. And other people say, Paul didn't write it at all. So there's a lot of different takes. Say, that's an interpolation. That's not even Paul. He doesn't mean that. Or is there something in the background that you can go back and watch the first episode of Biblical Rogues Gallery, introducing the book of Romans with all the background information that we can draw from to see what else is going on that might have this passage that seems to shift from admonitions in the second person plural to the third person singular. Seems to have very little to do with what was before it in chapter 12 and what follows it in verse 8. So it's just kind of there. And so let's get into that and read it and then see what we can get some initial thoughts from and then break it down a little bit further. Junior, you knew I was going to do this to you, right? I mean,
of course, absolutely.
You're back, and you just sound so much smarter than my Arkansas accent. Okay, you have a real accent. You have an actual British accent. So take it away, brother.
Here we go. Romans 13 verses 1 to 14 NASB reads.
It really is 1 through 7. My bad.
Oh, right. That's 1 through 7, right? Okay.
Yeah, I put 14 there, but then I said I don't have time to do all of that. That won't fit anyway. So 1 through 7.
So, let's go. Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 NASB reads, every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Pay to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, respect to whom respect, honor to whom honor.
Thank you for that, Junior. You sound so wonderful reading that. You could just read the phone book and everybody would enjoy it, and the ladies would too. Derek with the super chat for $1.99. Can I get a shout out for my Eliza's 8th birthday? Yes, you can.
Happy
Pritchard,
birthday.
I think you should sing for Eliza right now.
I think I will if we all do.
No,
We
you don't
actually
want me
we
singing.
actually have-
Boss has heard me sing in church on Sunday, so no.
Braxton has showed us. Why don't Braxton lead us in happy birthday for Eliza, and then we'll get
That's right.
Braxton can actually sing.
No, I won't be singing tonight unless there's hymns.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll sing. Happy birthday,
birthday
to
to
you. Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
you.
Happy
Happy
birthday,
birthday,
dear
dear
Eliza.
Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
We
you.
sound like a regular Baptist choir.
Do not play that for her. Don't play that for her. That's
Who are
terrible.
we singing for?
Derek's daughter.
Oh, well,
We had
happy
a-
birthday.
We had a super chat. Can I get a shout out for my Eliza's 8th birthday and horrible singing to go with it? Good for community.
Typical Baptists.
All right, so this passage, at what we call the just the plain reading, is pretty straightforward. It just says, every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which are established by God, which is pretty clear. And then he gives, in the rest of the passage, pretty straightforward admonitions that sound very generic, actually. But there are clues in the text, I think, that hint that there's something else going on here. Specifically, verses 6 and 7 kind of tip us off that there was extra focus going on here with the issue of taxes. He repeats that in 6 and 7. So there might be some background to that. But does anyone else have any initial thoughts about this passage that jumps out at you, whether just in the straightforward reading that we've had or in your studies so far?
Well, Pritchett, is it even authentic? And should we just move on to verses 8 through 14?
Well, of course, I think it's authentic. I'm a Christian, but when people like Jewett actually argue that it's authentic, because the arguments against its authenticity didn't even convince him, and he's one of those, more to the left in the spectrum of theological reading. I would say, yeah. I mean, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for all of us, I think.
I mean, there is no major textual reason to think it's inauthentic. And Brendan Byrne actually had a great comment. I found it. He says, a skillful interpolator, that is someone inserting the text or playing with the text, perhaps could have contrived this conformity to the language of the wider context. That is, how the similar words appear throughout Romans that appear here. So it's not, you can't claim, that there's linguistic disparity or lexical disparity. But the interpolation theory, while it may go a long way to save the reputation of Paul as a consistent theologian, does not, in the end, solve many problems. And he's a critical Roman Catholic. Oh, and Wes is here. Everyone talks about
Wes here with the fan or air on or something, causing a lot of fuzz in the background.
It's that beard. He needs to shave it off.
You'll be fine.
All that fuzz.
Is that better?
Yeah, especially since we can't.
Especially since we can't hear you now. Yeah, it's even better.
Your,
So much
your
better.
sound is pretty bad.
I actually just realized why. It's because my mic wasn't even in front of me.
It still sounds like trash. But anyway, yeah. Well, and he lists 4 rebuttals to that idea. Jewett does, but his concession is that even if this poses problems for theological interpretation or for conservative exegetes, he still thinks it's authentic, and it does kind of pose some problems. But I think actually Jewett gives some, and Longenecker as well, and Colin Cruz is a little bit more to the more rigid and stern end of the interpretation, and even he tries to find some wiggle room, because we actually have some. This raises, if you look at this as absolutist, it raises some problems given other things that are said in Romans and given the author without going to other passages of the Bible. And what we could say there would be, obviously, just a few chapters ago, he taught, God raised up Pharaoh, who was a wicked ruler, and then sent Moses to challenge his authority and to lead the Hebrew people out of captivity, overthrowing that order. So even within the book itself, you have the idea that this cannot be read as absolute. If you go back to the rest of the book of Romans, obviously Jesus died on the cross at the hands of the Romans. So they're not always doing like what is right and just and good,
Well, in Pritchett, you also have early, like Origen and Bart and others, Ambrosiaster, basically saying, yeah, this passage needs to be contextualized with other passages, indicating that they didn't see it as rigidly absolute either, which, I mean, I think is fairly fair when it comes to dealing with controversial texts. Okay, well, what do other texts maybe, how do we engage this text within Scripture as Scripture without just isolating it and playing with it as if it's the only thing in the play.
Right, but even the book of Romans with Jesus's death and resurrection doesn't allow for that. Paul's bringing up Pharaoh and Moses doesn't allow for that. And Paul himself was the victim of some unjust beatings and arrests in his ministry, so he doesn't obviously think that this is true in an absolute sense. But even if you just think of it in the terms of general wisdom, think about the book of Proverbs. Is the Proverbs absolutes? No, of course not. So you can temper this before we get into all that background stuff that in any other context with any other theological passage that's disputed, someone will say you're trying to get out of the plain reading of the text. But of course, there's no such thing as a plain reading of the text.
Hey, Pritchett. Yeah. Hey, Pritchett, real quick. The same people that say you're trying to get out of the same meaning of the text would have had a problem with this if they're born in Nazi Germany and quoted this text.
Yeah.
So we need to be very aware that often how you interpret these texts is very much contextual.
Yes. And it was Paul.
That's the irony, actually, in the entire thing is anyone who wants to say that you take a straight reading of the text, those are usually very conservative people, but yet usually those people are the same ones who would be like, well, I'm not shutting down my church during 2020 and all that. So just funny irony there that we're like, well, that's not what that text means. Suddenly you want to contextualize it when it suits your purposes. So
right. And let's also address the fact that there's nothing in the previous pericope in chapter 12. Some people say, well, you got to start. No, there is no, therefore, there's no, and for that, there's
it
no.
It begins with nothing like that. Yep. It's literally just there.
To anything before it. And it just, it seems as if you started at verse 8 from the end of chapter 12, it would seem to flow fine, which is another one of the points in favor of the interpolation thing, which we all reject. It's also to be not unexpected that a letter of this length would not be written down in one sitting, and it's very likely that this was previously composed material that needed to be inserted somewhere, and we're better than in between talking about the Christian ethic of love, and then, oh, by the way, there's a thing here, because you got to think about it. This is in the imperial city, and the God that has established all of this authority. He doesn't even talk about Caesar here or anything. I mean, Jesus can talk about Caesar and render under Caesar. He is writing to Rome, but he is just talking in the most generalistic terms about authorities that are established by the God who sent Jesus to die on the cross at the hands of the very authorities that he's saying to be subservient to. So you've got to keep all of that in mind. Plus, a little bit more background. This was written at a time where Seneca was administrating a lot of things for Nero, and actually, it wasn't going so bad in the Roman Empire at this point, right? It wasn't as bad as it was towards the end of Claudius, but you have the expulsion of the Jews, but then you have them returning. And so you had some chaos before this and some chaos after this, when Nero went nuts. But there is a time where things seem to be relatively stable. And so having a positive recommendation here doesn't seem out of sync with the time that Paul was writing in the mid to late 50s. So bear all that in mind, but there was some things going on at this time that you can find in Suetonius, that you can find in Tacitus, about heavy taxation, which also clues us into why he repeats that issue twice, especially from migrants who were getting heavily taxed, having to pay a lot of tolls, and people were getting very, very frustrated with the whole Roman system, that it was even recommended that they ease off on all the taxes that were being levied by the tax collectors running about through the imperial city. And if you have Jewish congregations that are just now returning from the exile, re-migrating back into Rome, they would have been subject to all of these taxes as well. On the other hand, you might also have some of the higher end, while most of the people in the churches of Rome, Jew or Gentile, were on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, there would undoubtedly be people in the higher end, especially those who work in the bureaucracy. So keep all those things in mind. This might be directed to a very small portion of the people, or to all of the churches trying to address different needs, and also trying to avoid fostering the frustration that could lead to behaviors that got the Jews kicked out in 49 all over again. So a lot of things to consider here without taking this as just an absolute, no matter what the government does. There's also in some of the Greco-Roman literature on this, the presumption, and you can find this all in the inscriptions, but from Plato forward, the assumption was that they're supposed to do good, right? And you're not going to ever compromise your integrity when they don't. But the general disposition was, if you are going to be a servant of the state, it is important that you engage and behave honorably, even though that didn't always happen. That was the Greco-Roman ideal. And so that the ideal is assumed in the background of the hearers, and it doesn't need to be said every 5 seconds, but if this, but if that, but if this other thing, that's where the idea of wisdom comes to play. So that's kind of a little bit of the lay of the land there. But again, you can take this as straightforward as you like. I'm just setting all of that out there so you know that's kind of a summary of what's going on in the scholarship for why that they don't think that this is necessarily absolute, because this is still a letter occasioned to a particular people for a particular purpose, which includes getting money for the mission to Spain, who would also have to pay a lot of taxes and not being citizens of Rome. And so some of these issues would no doubt be relevant for them and relevant for a positive estimation of the government, so that those in the church who work within the bureaucracy can see themselves as working for Yahweh, see themselves working for God, see them working for Jesus. That would be, hey, I'm an administrator of God too. I have a purpose here that might make things easier for Paul's continued mission. So there's a little bit of subversiveness going on as well, possibly. So there you go. I'll let y'all make some comments, and then we'll go verse by verse. Don't everybody.
Well, I'm over here trying to get a thumbnail set up to stream it to mine. So, but I have a few comments. I mean, I think some people, I brought the COVID thing up specifically because I heard this brought up a ton during COVID when I was pastoring a church on why I needed to close my church. And I was like, well, I don't think that's actually what that's trying to say. But it's important to know as well, as you mentioned, that this could be actually a very narrow focus. I think Paul's general point here is to be good citizens, as best citizens as you possibly can. Because on top of that, there's also, and I don't know if you mentioned this before I hopped on, I was a few minutes late, but there was a messianic movement actually a little bit before this that kind of got squashed. But so this idea of a group of people following this Christ figure, this other Messiah figure, could be very much causing social turmoil. And with that said, in Rome, how they would deal with social turmoil, because they didn't really care about what you believed as much as they cared about how you behaved. So they just didn't want you to cause upheaval, that you could actually have a bad reputation or cause scrutiny. And Paul was very conscientious on how people viewed the Christ community, especially in the Roman culture. So I think that's kind of what he's driving out here more than he is about blindly obeying your government. So that's my 2 cents.
There's also an issue of how do you survive in Caesar's world under the banner of imperialism and violence. So there's that aspect as well. How do you actually survive in when Caesar's the one that has the sword? And so there's that element as well. Pritchett, you were talking and sounding smart, but we couldn't hear you.
Well, I was trying to read this thing. What does Pritchett think about Nanos's proposal that Romans 13 is about synagogue leadership? To be honest, I haven't read it. I've only read the summaries of it by other commentators who said it's not worth reading. So
Yeah, it's an intriguing idea, but having read it, there's a reason why the view hasn't gained a lot of acceptance, and if it has, it actually creates some really interesting issues as well, given ethnic conflict and other things with Paul. So, yeah, I'm not convinced by it. It's an interesting idea that is kind of like the interpolation hypothesis, not really substantial.
Yeah, the reason for the interpolation hypothesis rests on one grammatical thing and then a bunch of we don't like it things. That's kind of the shift from second person plural to third person singular, and no connective conjunctions or formulas.
Well, the fact that the word for governing authorities or whatever is used to describe the emperor in 1 Peter 2:3. So,
yeah, and
so it's a very odd word to use to describe Jewish synagogue leadership, at least in the New Testament.
Yeah, that whole idea had nothing to commend it to me. It didn't. When I was reading the summaries, just the idea of it made me think, okay, because I'm not opposed on spec to any takes. Okay, but when I read what I thought were fairly charitable descriptions of it, and then why they didn't think it worked, I was like, I don't need to read that. That's not gonna go anywhere for most people, and that seems to be less of an issue for a. But I mean, remember, Nanos thinks this is an overwhelmingly Jewish audience for Romans, right? And that has to figure as well. We've already rejected that hypothesis in our introductory episode. So even still, I don't know how much we can argue that the Roman churches were making that the Jewish portions of the Roman church were making use of the synagogues, given the expulsion over this Crestus thing from Claudius back in 49, that they would go right back to where all the chaos started in Rome that got all the Jews, including probably the Jewish Christians, kicked out in the first place. So it just really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But
you're a minority within a minority within a minority in a very big imperial city. You're probably going to want to be careful about going back to the things that didn't work last time and got you in trouble.
Yeah, it seems like by the late 50s in Rome, they were probably doing these assemblies more in a patron's house than they were the Jewish congregation still running.
Well, Priscilla and Aquila, specifically Romans 16, the church that meets in y'all's house. So
right, yeah. So all of I think there's just enough common sense and internal evidence that I don't need to go explore it further. Amber, do you have any thoughts on that whole take, or?
Well, I was thinking about, I got to go see N.T. Wright speak a couple weeks ago, I think 3 weeks ago or so. I don't remember.
I don't like you. Nope.
Yeah, well,
don't like Amber anymore.
Get over yourself, Will. Just get over it, Wes. But one of the things that I heard, he was talking about something completely different, but he addressed this a little bit in this section in the second session we were in, that it wasn't specifically this section of Romans, but he was talking about the interaction of church and government a little bit. And he said something about that the Christian church shouldn't care so much how people get into power. It's what they do with it when they get there. And the church's role is to hold power accountable, to be good governance, to be good caretakers of those put in their charge. And so this really kind of, to me, echoed back to what Wright was talking about, how we should, as the church, hold those in authority and accountable in the same time that we are underneath their care as a civic authority. You know, there's that balance of being under that when it doesn't violate God's law, and pushing back when it does, and holding them accountable. So that's kind of where I'm thinking as we're going through this section here.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything in this section properly understood, at least within a more of a wisdom context. contextualized for a specific audience that has broader principles. That's the thing. Whenever people think, oh, you're trying to limit this contextually so you can get out of broader principles, that's never the case. That's not even the case with 1 Corinthians 11 head coverings. It's never the case with egalitarian readings of 1 Timothy 2. You're not trying to contextualize it to get out of broader applications. You're trying to rightly exegete it so that you pull out the proper applications, which you will go wrong if you don't have a solid exegesis. And like I said in my opening salvo, there's enough before we go to I'd rather obey God than man in Acts and anywhere else that you could try to do this. I mean, the idea that God established authorities is well documented, attested in the Old Testament. Jeremiah says so, Proverbs says so, Daniel says so. So nobody's trying to get around that. But what we're trying to say here, or at least what I'm trying to say, is I think that there's enough internal evidence in Paul's life and in the book of Romans with Jesus' death and resurrection, Paul's life getting beaten and arrested, but that they're not always just, and they're, just even there. But then you go to the rest of the Bible and see defiance of governments, Daniel, all of that. So you don't read this as absolute subservient. You read this with the lens of wisdom. And one of the things that I liked that brought this passage around for me also is instead of first jumping to the theological ideas behind this text, which you can do, you can always keep in mind Paul's missional context. He's wanting to establish a base of operations to do ministry in Spain. And so there's a missional angle to this, especially with the fact that there might be some of the wealthier patrons involved in the bureaucracy at Rome to see themselves as trying to make a way for that. And the apologetic of 1 Peter 3 is all about your good behavior and suffering, even if you do good. Don't give. It's the apologetics of the earliest apologists too. Be good citizens, right? Insofar as you can. But I mean, sometimes you can't.
Well, and let's not forget too, with all of this going on in Romans 13, what Paul ultimately thinks will happen to the powers. God destroys them in 1 Corinthians 15. So lest we get high over our skis, we need to be theologically consistent and allow Paul to be consistent with himself. And last I checked, he must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet, refers back to the principalities and powers and the rulers of this age. So it's one of those where unless Paul is severely unable to keep a train of thought going or to be internally consistent, we have to be precise and careful with what he does. Or what we do with his language, specifically when he says God's going to destroy these things anyway.
I think that also echoes to Colossians, right? Too, in regards to like principalities and powers and Christ having defeated them on the cross. But even when you go to, I think, Colossians 1, and I have a reading from it right here, was when he mentions being delivered from one dominion of darkness and translated to the kingdom of his son, through whom we have redemption, so on and so forth. And he also mentions, whether we rulers, powers, dominions, powers, all things are created by him and for him. So I think that could also harmonize with this passage as well when Paul talks about, I think, because N.T. Wright also mentions that, similar to what you just mentioned, how these principalities and powers either have been defeated already by Christ and they are a part of God's working order and will, or have been, like this already not yet, have been put back into their rightful place to do everything in accordance according to his will. So where does the church fit in that? And I think that keys in with what Amber said and with what JP, where they do right, then fine. But if it's in conflict of, God and ethics and so on and so forth, according to Christian faith, then we kind of pull them up.
Right.
We see them as temporary, not eternal.
Right.
Yeah. But the problem for everything that Paul has said about transformation, renewal from your mind, not conforming to this age, the glorious freedom that all creation is going to be released from bondage. There could be, for those who are on the lower end of the spectrum in the Roman audience, a tendency to think, well, if all of that's true, then why do we care about this present age at all and have to be subservient to the government? And why should we pay attention to this? Paul said we are going to reign with Christ, in Romans chapter 5. So why worry about any of this stuff we're having to deal with from the governing authorities around us in the imperial city? And there might be some tendencies to want to quell any sort of rebellion that might foster up within the Christian church that might think that they can become poor citizens and be standoffish and not do good to forget what God told them in Jeremiah about, go ahead and marry and build houses and whatever's good for the city will be good for you. All of that. They forget all that and say, the heck with all that. We're just going to, we're just going to forget this government and start our own hippie commune or something. And that's just not going to work for Paul, especially when he has aims to use the bureaucracy to his advantage every time he can, even when he's invoking his own citizenship to get a free trip to Rome. I mean, there is some subversiveness to this, but there's also maybe a fear that the people who've had enough of the Roman government in the imperial city may want to revolt from it because, there's a lot of movements like that. So Paul doesn't want them to get caught up in it either, which could be why some of this general language. Now, to your point, Junior, about the powers and principalities, one of the issues that people have asked about the governing authorities here is whether or not that includes only earthly governing authorities or even the spiritual beings. But as there are some commentators that say it's a both and here, not just the visible powers, but the invisible ones. But you had referenced some verses, you and Nick both, from Colossians and 1 Corinthians, that those powers are pretty much defeated insofar as what they can do. And so most people think that here, and plus the language here,
pay taxes.
Yeah, the language here and throughout this text seems to be more earthbound authorities. But there was some commentaries out there that tried to say this was the powers and principalities, but you don't see any of that language here. You don't have any of the cosmic powers from Romans 5 through 8 discussed in this passage at all. Seems to be mostly human governments.
I think that's why they mentioned that, is because prior to, Paul mentions, Romans 5, Romans 8, and so on and so forth. So I think they tried to stay contextual. But then as writing notes here, I've got his commentary on this passage here, and he also cross-references Corinthians and Colossians when it talks about, paying taxes and giving respect and honor and so on and so forth. He would say it's more like a kill shot to earthly rulers.
Yeah.
He doesn't even see that as a both and. He's just like, nah.
Yeah. I go with that take. But Nick, the apocalyptic guy, loves cosmic powers. Are you gonna shill for this being a both and here, or are you gonna just kind of side with the consensus?
It seems the consensus is probably right. If the cosmic powers are there, then they're kind of at the background of everything. I don't think they are primarily in view, if they are there at all. And I'm just, I don't know. I think it's perfectly fine for Paul to talk trash on the demons and to talk trash on, those who have allied themselves with them.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It doesn't seem to make sense that he's referencing cosmic powers with that right at this point within the letter anyway. That just, I don't know, it feels like a weird shoehorn to me.
Right. Yeah. And in verse 2, therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not the cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the saying. This cannot possibly be read from Paul as an absolute principle, right? Because he has done good and had some unjust behavior, especially opposing he's resisted authority. And even if we were to go with Nanos, he's resisted Jewish authorities that he used to be himself, right? He got in plenty of trouble with the Jewish authorities as well as the Roman ones. So I can't see anything that would make me think that this could be read as an absolute. And I also don't see anything here that could be read in a synagogue context either, because Paul certainly never followed both to where this was like universally true at all times and all places, even though it would be the case where Paul would say, generally speaking, yes. you don't need to resist these God established authorities, because in general, you don't receive condemnation for opposing them. You receive praise, which, by the way, going back to Seneca, he also was a contemporary of Paul, writing a whole bunch of stuff as well as helping with Nero's administration. And he often wrote about how, civil servants should go about promoting the honor of the citizens who did good by way of the state, because that was kind of in this, the reciprocity and establishing of honor played through government and civilian alike, in the same way of just the patron-client reciprocity system in general. That a good commendation, right? A good commendation rather than condemnation, which brought you shame and dishonor. A commendation and praise from civil would boost your honor, and that could boost the honor of those within the Christian community. So Paul is saying here that behave well, and you will receive praise from these authorities, and you won't have to fear them, and that promotes the honor of the Christian community and their standing in the polis. So that's how I would read that text.
That's actually a very good take.
Well,
Basically just agreeing with me. I love when Pritchett does that.
Yeah,
It's usually when he's right.
Do you? Is Amber going to say I'm right as well, or Amber, do you see this a little bit? Are you going to find a problem?
She can't say you're right out of principle.
Right. Well, Paul said, Junior. Junior thinks that I got it right. Paul, I'm not calling you Paul.
Weird.
It's like Paul wrote, and they're going to think you. Junior, we like Junior. Amber.
Yeah, I will concede the point on this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Only because she's thought of it first.
Well, I'm not trying to be a Mike Hogg. It's just I think y'all are trying to avoid anyone calling y'all a liberal for not taking the most straightforward reading tonight.
Dude, I get called a liberal every day on X just because I'm like, women can be pastors, and people are like, soy, and I'm like, you know what? Fight me, bro. It's all good.
Well, I don't see in the pattern of Scripture, you can't get to an absolute authoritarian liberal. Only one thing reading of this. There's no way you can get there. So it has to open itself up to be like, yeah. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, see, I think texts like this are a good test case for hermeneutics too, because if you're going to look into the background of a passage to try to get out of the straightforward, I say that with quotes, right? That's going to apply to every passage you read. That's going to apply to theologically, dense passages. It's going to apply to everything, because the background to every single text is everything is occasioned. Everything is contextual in the time for its author and audience. 100% of text. I don't care if it's a didactic text or a narrative or whatever it is contextualized to its original author and audience and their situation in life, okay, at that time in those places, period. Background is required for any ancient text. And when you remove the pressure on a text like this, feel free to remove that pressure on any text that you think is may say a little bit more or say something different than the lens you bring to it. Because if you're bringing your lens to it without doing any research at all into the background of the situation in Rome, you're assuming, oh, well, if if a police officer pulls me over and pulls Junior over, because they're not going to do it to me, but if you look like Junior, you pull him over and start beating the crap out of him, are you supposed to take? I don't know. I mean, I don't think British cops are. Well, I don't know. Let's say Junior posts a meme over there that his government doesn't like. The lady cop with the baton is going to show up at his house with some harsh words and saying, "You're going to jail," right? I mean, are you supposed to just take that and not voice any sort of displeasure or complaint or resistance? No, it's absurd in any circumstance. So,
well, Pritchett, we'll make it simple. I didn't hear conservatives complaining about what's going on today, but I also didn't hear liberals complaining about authoritarianism 4 years ago. So how about we just shut our mouths about this and try to be consistent?
Yeah, but I agree. And my overall point is wisdom help. That's why I liken it to not just doing your background research for what this could possibly mean within the context of Romans and the situation at Rome between Paul and his audience, but within the context of how you would read Proverbs that are not absolute promises of the Bible. You apply wisdom to these texts because, generally speaking, if the government wants you to obey traffic laws, and you won't receive shame and punishment and condemnation. But if they want you to do things that are contrary to your faith, like don't pray in public, you can't go to church because of certain viruses or whatever
You
else.
can't be based like Nick and Will on the weekends.
Right.
Nah, we won't fight.
Mhm.
Maybe
It's hard being us. It is.
Yeah, it's really impossible. That's why God only made two of us.
That's right.
and they start beating you up for having silent prayers and throwing you in prison for having silent prayers outside of abortion clinics. Maybe some resistance is called for, right?
Absolutely. Right, Pookie?
That's right, Pookie.
Y'all saw he answered that, just so you know.
Yeah.
Bridget didn't jump up to answer that.
Yeah, because they're not in every single 100% of the time. And we know this because 13? Okay, wow. 5 chapters ago, we talked about, or 4 chapters ago, we talked about Pharaoh and Moses. And obviously, Pharaoh was wicked and Moses was leading the resistance at the urging of God. God raised up Pharaoh. God raised up Moses. It's both and. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, Paul is obviously well versed in the Old Testament, and he knows the pattern. Whenever we, there's submit to whatever the governing authority is, things go well, and God will punish the government authority. I mean, Assyria gets taken down for going too far, punishing Israel. Babylon gets taken down for going too far, punishing Judah. It's just a pattern. When the civil authority gets too far outside of God's design, God takes them out. It just from the beginning all the way through. And I think Paul is that's in his mind when he's writing this. We don't have to worry about it because God is ultimately going to punish that and take that into account at a certain point.
Yeah, there are takes that are, pacifist takes on passages like this is for full compliance and non-resistant. And if, whatever happens. I think that may take it too far. But, everyone's got their take, I guess. But Paul goes on in verse 4, "For it is a servant of God servant of God to you for good." Now, this language about good here, I can't divorce that from what we've talked about. The good starting in chapter 12 about good being in that which is in alignment with the will of God, right? So if it's out of alignment with the will of God, I don't know that this verse could make any sense, right? So I there might be another just on pains of language that this can't be absolute, but insofar as it aligns with God's will. What do y'all think about that?
Well, I think I definitely agree with that because again, we could reiterate many times, but otherwise we'd have to be forced to admit that tons of people in Scripture are actually disobeying Paul's statement here. Not only that, Paul would be disobeying Paul. So he was stoned for not listening to the Jewish law. I mean, if he was talking about all authorities, spiritual authorities or governmental authorities, he would be in violation of his own words.
Yeah. So good here goes back to, in verse 3, Agathon goes back to the same use, the good and acceptable and well-pleasing to God, to God in chapter 12. So I would say that if it's there for good, it is a servant of God to you for good. If it's not if it violates that good, then I don't know that. I think you have some room to get out of applying this universally, because if it's a servant, and that's that deacon word right there, right?
Which one?
And verse 4.
Right. But which one's the servant one?
Diakonos, it's the word for
Yeah,
deacon.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just making
Which,
sure I'm following
which is
you.
not a, I mean, that's what he uses for Phoebe later, but I mean, that's not just a word that's for a church office, but it is a word that has wider usage in the literature, the secular literature of the time, for, just general servants of the polis. So, but he's using that same language here, being a servant of God for these government agents that God has placed there, even if they're pagan, right, for good. But if they're not doing the good, then I don't think that you can just apply this, because he goes on to say, but if you do what is evil, and he has defined that as conforming to the spirit of the age, if you're doing what is evil, you should be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a servant of God. There he repeats that language again. An avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So, assuming that this government is functioning within the sphere that God has given it, this is the normal operations. Don't do what is evil, because they have the right of the sword to punish, right, and to avenge the wrath. So the idea here is that in general, a government is there to keep a functional order among humans, right? Because he's not specifically just talking about, he's not using overly technical language in this passage. He's making it somewhat broad, but he's also saying, on normal grounds, this allows society to function. That's why God has ordained such authorities. Now, is there a type of authority that God has ordained? No, there's not one specific biblical model of government. Certainly, they're not baptizing empire here, which means, we live in a democracy or a republic or whatever. And so there's all sorts of forms of government that God has ordained. And I don't think he's baptized any of them other than Jesus is king and will be co-rulers in the age to come. But on this side of the eschaton, generally speaking, the government is to perform a function, which, keeping that order, allows for the church to go about being good citizens and proclaiming the gospel without, getting a horrible reputation. So that's kind of how I'm seeing that. But, if you start violating commands and you start killing people, well, you're going to be put to death.
Right. Well, this is why I think Paul has a particular strategy here as well. Like Paul, it seems like it's more of a, and maybe I'm completely incorrect. Does it seem like it's more of a strategy for survival rather than a blanket endorsement of all government actions?
Yes.
So by advocating for submission, he may have been advising Christians basically to avoid unnecessary conflict with Roman authorities, preserving their community during a volatile time.
Yeah, because this is not nearly as volatile as it will be from Nero 10 years from less than 10 years from the time he's writing. Nero goes insane.
In the future.
Yeah, and starts using that sword for evil against good people. I mean, this passage could not have been written 10 years later. It really couldn't have. Not to the imperial city where Christian bodies were lining the streets as torches on cross. I mean, it couldn't have had this would not have been written 10 years. That's why it's important to look at what's going on, right? Because he's going to get to what's really going on when we get to verses 6 and 7. But verse 5, and by the way, there is some discussion in the literature, and I'd like to get y'all's take on it, but specifically want to call on Nick, because he probably knows more about the ins and outs of this as I do. The bear the sword, Jewett tries to downplay the idea that this means capital punishment and tries to talk about, police people walking around with daggers, but they weren't really, he's trying to get away from the idea that the government authority was instilled, that this Paul had in mind the idea up to capital punishment. So I wonder if you know more about that, because I was like, huh?
Looking at just the term in the New Testament and not looking at like Philo or Josephus or anyone, it doesn't really look like it's used for capital punishment. It looks like it's just a weapon of war. Just kind of so it doesn't look like it's used for capital punishment. It looks as just a weapon that kills people. So there's no need to make it actual capital punishment. But there's also a sword is still a sword.
Yeah, there's very little reason to preclude that in my mind, because the sword is a weapon of war in the Septuagint. It's a weapon of war just in general in the New Testament for all sorts of purposes. And it seems like doing what is evil is an avenger who brings wrath in the context of having the power of the sword, bearing the sword. So it seems to me that Jewett and some of the people that want to downplay the violence of this text don't really the government sanctioned the God ordained government sanctioned use of violence. That reading, no, Paul intends to say that they have that right here, because I don't see an avenger who brings wrath is somebody who's just waving it like those British cops do to Junior with their little batons that they,
we're gonna get you. We're gonna get you.
We're gonna get you. Yeah.
My 2 little feet, man. Of course.
Well, but the word is used in Romans 8:35 to describe, danger or sword or something like that.
Yeah, and
So,
life and death in that same context. So come on, neither life nor death. Come on. So it seems to me that the threat there in Romans 8, the 31 through 39, including that kind of language, seems to me it's like the sword is not there to pat you on the back with. It's there to cause you problems if you do evil. Now, again, 10 years later from now, that sword was used for unjust things by the Nero and his, government administration at that time. So, like, again, I don't want to say what wouldn't have been the case, but I'm going to say I'm like 80% sure that Paul could not say this 10 years later than when he did. Is that fair? Or
I mean, he'd be dead by then, so he couldn't have.
Well, fair.
They probably would have the sword that these principalities and powers probably would have killed him by then, because they technically did.
Yeah, well, about 11 or 12 years, yeah, depending on when you date Roman. So
what do Pritchett? What do we do with Tasso in 3:1 or 13:1?
I think it. I mean, whether it's middle or passive, I don't freak out about the middle tense, like, oh, it's never, because it is used in the New Testament. So I do think it is the you submitting yourself, right? You're not.
No, that's Tasso in that's the second clause or the third clause. All of these have been instituted or ordained or appointed by God, not the hupatasso.
What are you talking about?
Hupatasso is submit or be subjected in the first clause. Let every soul or person be subject to the governing authorities, clause 1.
Oh, you're back on verse 1. I thought you were talking about verse 5.
No. But I mean, the same root word. I mean, they both use tasso, hupatasso, tasso, all that. But I was curious about the third clause. Those that exist, and this is, the authorities that exist have been established by God. That's the NIV, so grain of salt there. Do we take? I'm wondering if tasso there reflects, and the whole debate about middle or passive is just kind of dumb. Usually, it doesn't really get you anywhere. But here, I think you do have an implicit, you might say, as Pritchett, I don't know if you used this word earlier, of what we call subversion's not the right word, but the fact that these authorities, the governing authorities, which would be the Roman Empire, are assigned or established, or you might say constructed by God, does indicate their subordinate status to God. And the question I think we would ask is, do they recognize this or not? And that assumes that we have Christian, all that sort of stuff.
Back on verse 1 is you could ask several questions. Is that every person, whether Christian or not, because the language is vague there? I think it's every Christian person in Rome is really what how I'd read the every person. Non-Calvinist saying all doesn't always mean all, but you could read it every soul, you could think it was more general of a statement. I don't think so. Now, as far as subject to the governing authorities,
if you think the first clause is general, or we might say generic. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but it's an idea. The second one is laying out the rationale, the for, or at least some sort of cause or for, depending on how you render gar or for. But for there is no authority except from God. the authorities that exist have been established by God. But the second is, how do we translate or understand established? Is that either way, the relationship here is not identical. In fact, that you have these powers being subordinated to God indicates, one, I don't think they would appreciate that too much.
Yeah, I mean,
Given that these are pagan nations. But second, just to make my point real quick, if you have Tasso here as kind of a deterministic construct, eternally established from the foundations of the world sort of thing, or do you render it something more along the lines of appointed? And of course, we would say appointed having a temporal focus. And if that's the case, then that adds an additional element that undermines an exhaustive or deterministic reading of this text. I'm
Yeah.
not talking determinism epistemologically. I'm talking the scope and impact and rigidness of the interpretation.
yeah, it's interesting. Cruz, who's a Calvinist commentator, he was talking about this, and he was quoting an early church father. Let's see if I can find it, because he was talking about even the early church fathers weren't necessarily saying that God seemed to pick every single individual. I mean, God does pick kings when he wants to, but this is a little bit more broad, to where it was like, God has established these governing authorities, not necessarily the people who occupy them. And so, but whoever does occupy them, that is, that person is fulfilling the role that God has either allowed them to have or not. I can't remember where it was that I read that earlier today, actually, and I'm trying to find it, and I'm trying to just fill up the silence while I look.
Well, here, I'll fill up the silence real quick. Tasso, when there's two different relationships you have here. To be in a relationship where there of a form of subordination or a form of institution or appointment is not this. You have to ask about the relationship of these individuals or agents. For example, Christ being head over all things in Ephesians 1. Hey, you stop being silly and playing with everything.
He's getting in trouble.
Okay, hold on. Nolan Shark is in trouble. We have to share this.
Okay.
Is the shark in trouble?
Yeah.
Is he one of the governing authorities?
Yeah.
If so, can you play God and smash him under your feet? That's my boy. All right, we'll move on.
Based.
Way to go, Nugs.
Yeah.
So anyway, the relationship, it depends on the relationship. If you have a form of subordination or submission between, as Paul talks about, mutual submission in Ephesians 5, that's a different relationship between Christ's relationship to the powers or to constructs that, engage in those sorts of ways. So we can't make it automatic go, oh, this is a positive construction. It's like you have God raising up leaders all the time, using Pharaoh as an example, setting up rulers. So,
right. But that's like for Theodoret, he says the Holy Apostle teaches us that both authorities and obedience depend entirely on God's providence, but he does not say that God has specifically appointed one person or another to exercise authority, for it is not the wickedness of individual rulers which comes from God, but the establishment of the ruling power itself, since God wants sinners to be punished. And that's true. In this one, he doesn't say that he raised up any particular person, which Paul could go further, but he's talking more in general terms. Chrysostom points that out. He says it does not speak about individual rulers, but the principle of authority itself. For that there should be rulers and ruled, and that things should not just lapse into anarchy, with the people swaying like waves from one extreme to the other, is the work of God's wisdom. So Theodoret and Chrysostom don't see any particular person. And if Paul wants to use a particular, or talk about God using particular rulers, the Bible tells us when God establishes an individual. It tells us when he doesn't, by just using general language like we find here. So I don't think that you can do a theology that that God chose Trump, right? Or that God chose Biden. And before that, God chose...
Or rather, if he did, you might not like the fact that he did choose them for the purpose of which he's using them for.
But I mean, if you have a broader view of providence, when God wants to prop up a king, he does. When God wants to allow certain things to play out, given people's choices and actions and reason, he does. He can do it either way, right? I mean, we're not the ones that limiting everything to like God decreed from eternity past for this reason. God raised up Biden so that he could, I don't know,
make the price of eggs go up.
Right. Well, I mean, he did. He over a
See,
Bird
there's the thumbnail that everyone wanted. Clip that, everyone.
but yeah, I mean, but before he leaves office, he ordered his FDA murdered millions of birds. I know they say 100,000. No, it's way more than that.
Birds' lives matter.
Yeah, chickens' lives matter. And by the way,
don't get Pritchett on his chickens.
the FDA shows up my house,
Pritchett and Cosmic Skeptic agree on this.
and Romans 13 goes out the window if if FDA come to my house for my chickens. I'm like, nuh-uh.
They can come for me, but not for my chickens.
This ain't New
He's
York
not-
City and Evansville. Evansville's not New York City. You
Homeboy
can't
has
kill a
30
raccoon.
chickens.
Yeah, you can't. My chickens are not a raccoon in New York City. Do not come and take my chickens.
That's not a raccoon. That was a squirrel. Rest in peace.
Oh, squirrel. Well, there was a squirrel and a raccoon, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Well, that's a deep cut. Shoot.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, I ain't following.
The boss is shaking her head. It looks like she's being way too intelligent for this conversation. Boss, what do you think?
I'm just saying. If Romans 13, I'm going to take the non-absolutist reading of this because I'm not putting up with the FDA trying to kill my chickens over a bird flu they don't have. I'm just saying.
Amber's just thinking how she gave up her Monday night to hang out with us. And
Well,
bitch
let's
about
be real.
chickens.
It's not like she had anything better to do. than to
Never
waste
bring
time
up
with us.
chickens if you don't want a 2-hour derailment from me on chickens.
No, I mean, this is y'all. For those who don't know, Pritchett's chickens are basically like the Boston Tea Party in tea. You come for my chickens, I'm overthrowing the government.
That's right. Absolutely correct. 100%.
I mean, he dressed up his chickens with orange wigs and put American flags on them and had them run around. Just
I will arm
My
the
wife
chickens
right now, because of Pritchett, is obsessed with. She's sending me videos on chickens now, so we're getting chickens.
this is the content this stream needed. The world needs this.
Look, Trinity Radio with Ralph Braxton. This can become a homesteading channel. This can become a fitness channel. This can be whatever I want it when he's not around. And dadgummit, tonight, everyone go buy you some chickens.
I'm huge into
I'm telling
chickens.
you right now, this is probably why I'm streaming this to my channel as we speak, and somebody apparently disliked our video. They don't like it, so
That's
I'm into
fine.
fitness too. Fitness chicken in
That's
my
fine,
mind.
but you need to shout out Fisherman's Corner.
yeah. Well, I can't do that because you're the host. So thanks, Fisherman's Corner, for getting 10 church split memberships. If you're watching this, go claim them. I have 2 videos currently right now for members only that will be released later for the general public. But yeah, I have 2 videos right now exclusively for members. One is the theology of the body, talking about male and female. And then the other one is a sermon I gave yesterday, which I'm pretty sure Pritchett wasn't here.
On anxiety.
Well, not really.
Now I'm
but
nervous to listen to it.
Yeah.
I am anxiety inducing.
Yes, you are. Here's every
How much can we make Boss laugh and not join us? The goal now for the rest of the stream is to exegete the passage and watch Boss just roll her eyes and get a headache.
folks, coming up in a month and a half, by April 15th, you'll have to file your taxes. And this is every CPA's favorite verse, IRS's agent's favorite verse in the Bible next to the one about rendering under Caesar. Because they probably even like this more than Jesus. Because number one, if you work for the IRS, you don't love Jesus. And number two, Jesus didn't say this, and it just talks about taxes in general. So
Careful, Pritchett. The IRS have guns now, and they count them bullets that they use.
yeah, well, this is one thing. Now, I know if you see me on this channel, you think I'm always critical of Trump, but sending the IRS agents to become border patrol, I'm yay Trump. I'm for that because I hate the IRS. For
It
this,
needs to be abolished, but yeah.
anyway, we were talking about subjection, and I quoted church fathers why I think that this is about the principle of authority. But back to that idea in verse 5, hypotasestai, same.
Good job.
I've had Greek before, man.
You'd have?
Everyone thinks when I say something, say a Greek word, everyone's like surprised. It's like the same,
It was that one time when you had that cool gel in your mouth and you were just talking like got a lisp and you got you're born in San Francisco.
Arkansas. Cut him some slack. That's not
No,
like me
I
pronouncing stuff.
had oral gel all in my. I have horrible teeth. Some of those are actually fake, folks. I could.
I
pull
couldn't tell, so those are pretty
Yeah.
good. I
No,
went
I
to a
have a lot of
dentist.
dental work, and so I had like oral gel in my mouth that one night. And I could barely talk, and my Greek sounded worse than my English. It was,
A little suffering attacks the whole night. It was wonderful.
yeah, and then the next day, y'all were making fun of me on Trinity Radio because I kept because it healed up a little bit, but then I sounded like someone with I sounded like someone with no front teeth, and I couldn't say peas.
Sound like you lived in San Francisco in the 60s.
Oh, thanks. Sounds like you switched teams for a while. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Yeah. So this idea about submitting yourself here in verse 5, I think, is number one. In verse 1, the authorities are in submission. I think indirectly. If you want to talk about that, because you are subject to these ordained authorities, but not every authority is going to be like on the level for God. He doesn't, just because he ordained the positions of authority doesn't mean he approves of everyone in authority, nor does he
I have a
necessarily
question.
approve of the form of government. But here in verse 5, yes, you are to put yourself in subjection. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection. I like the NASB on this, because that says you need to do this. And, it's still in this talking about you individually arranging yourself, right?
All right, I have a question for Boss, because I think this is actually interesting. So, verse 2, the ESV renders it as resist. The NIV renders it as rebels in the first clause. Therefore, whoever resists or rebels contra the authorities. I was curious because the Old Testament does seem to allow a lot of resistance to God from the people of God, or at least very, very petty, very, very strongly worded questioning of God. And so I was curious about your take, not on the lexical stuff, because that's, whatever, but how do we interpret, how do we understand this resist rebels in light of Paul's kind of background of kind of like Old Testament theology and clapping back at God, when Paul clearly is, I don't think he's doing anything new here, but maybe he's being contextual. But what are your thoughts on that from like the Old Testament perspective as it relates to resisting the authority, so to speak?
Resisting or rebelling against authority?
Well, that's the question. Is it resist, oppose, rebel? Is it violent? Is it revolutionary? Is it insurrect? Because the word can mean all those sorts of things. But maybe the Old Testament background, how could that maybe help guide us through this rather than just being, don't resist them? It's like, well, resist is a vague word, if that makes sense.
I'm wondering why this porque no los dos, like why can't it be both resist and rebel depending on the situation? Because you see, like in Daniel, you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing up in it. Is that resistance or is that rebellion? I mean, you've got Daniel, and that is, is that resistance or is that rebellion? You've got Ezekiel is doing his own thing over there and in exile that is going to be standing in opposition to the Babylonian government. You just Jeremiah gets thrown into a well because he's not popular because he's speaking out against the government. And so I'm not sure I actually see a distinction between resistance and rebellion when they're standing up to something that is out of line with God's spoken word. It does it matter? Is it really a difference or is it not? I don't know that I see the distinction in a measurable way when somebody, the government or somebody does something against God's Torah, then people don't do or do the thing they're not supposed to or supposed to do with what God says instead of what man says. Is that resistance or is that rebellion? I don't know that I contextually see a great big difference there, but that's maybe just me.
No, that's helpful, because I wondered if there was a difference to begin with, and I wonder if the Old Testament might shed a light, and it looks like the Old Testament is, well, yes, if that makes
Floral
sense.
from Iraq, one of my favorite people on Twix, says Hess resists authority of God, the Bible, so he can cuss. Thank you for the fake Canadian dollars. He's confused.
Wes or Floral?
I'm not going to answer that because I know Wes off camera.
Oh yeah, me too. Never mind.
No, I'll say. I mean, I'll say it like this whole. I mean, do you really want that? Do we want to open that can of worms right now, Pritchett? I'm happy to open that can of worms right now.
I mean, we've
That
talked
can
about
of
chickens for
worms.
like the past 10 minutes. I guess at this point, you can throw anything on the barbecue if you want to.
Yeah, Pritchett's the host though, so I have to make sure I behave in his house.
The anti-tesomenos is the opposite of the subject yourself. So my take is you are to do one and not do the other. So, but again, not absolute. But I would say I don't mind. I don't mind saying, don't. I don't mind. Don't resist authority in the sense you're opposing the ordinance of God, insofar as you understand in context that when it's within the will of God, because it could be the will of God that you do have to resist. But in normal means, obey the law, and so don't resist the law if it, if there's nothing that interferes with your faith about the law, you should not be resistant to authorities when so far they aren't conflicting with your faith. I see no reason to think that you have that. That's where the wisdom comes in, and that's where the knowledge of your faith comes in for your ethic. That don't resist authorities if you have no biblical basis to do so, like cussing or something. Well, I don't know that,
Right.
but not that. There actually used to be laws against public profanity, but those laws don't exist anymore.
Correct. Well, and then
So
also
would
that's
you
not
be
the Bible.
disobeying
When it
if you
talks about-
didn't do it?
When it talks about cursing, it does. It's not when it says like don't curse one another. It's not talking about modern day cuss words.
Yeah, we've had this conversation on Trinity Radio Primetime Forum. And I think I've mentioned it here before. If we want to derail this, I mean, I'd rather talk about chickens than.
Just give it like 3 minutes. And
not
just,
even-
like we can pretty much cook it right now.
Just cut this video, and then you got a 3-minute thing that'll go out and get everyone angry, and you get 10,000 views. There you go.
I agree with Wes that the Bible doesn't forbid certain cuss words. Okay, cursing doesn't mean like slang, right? Unwholesome talk, coarse joking. I don't need any of those words you can't say on primetime television to be unwholesome or coarse joking. By the way, the King James translators in Ezekiel 23 didn't need naughty words in order to be quite vulgar. So, two things I want to make about this derailed, this declension.
Hey, Floral got us here, so you may as well. It's fine.
Yeah.
Respect my authority.
So one, again, it's a general rule of thumb. It is not an absolute. Because you have to weigh the precepts of Scripture against the phenomenon of Scripture itself. Be kind, but also go castrate yourself. That's not kind, right? In the same book, that do good to everyone, especially the household of faith. But
I mean, we don't get mad at God for literally saying, "I'm going to incinerate your city and kill all of you for your sinful stuff." Oh, but naughty words are what get this going.
My position is this: there are no naughty words. Technically, there are naughty ways to construe any word. That's number one. There are not any no words. There are no contexts. I would not say the same things in front of Wes in private that I would in front of your grandmother. Okay, it would just that's where it becomes.
Well, that's because my grandmother can handle the words.
Well, okay, maybe your grandmother, but not Amber. So there's
wait. Okay, hold on a second there.
So it's not that matter of the words; it's a matter of the context and how you use the words to be coarse and unwholesome, and you shouldn't do it. And except for those times, like if you're dressing down the northern and southern kingdom, then it's okay to use very graphic imagery about the bodily fluids of horses and donkeys and their members.
There is some very pornographic language in the book of Ezekiel, especially chapter 16. Gets really raw and gritty. So there's lots of places in the Old Testament where if you actually had a literal translation of some of that language, would make a lot of people extremely uncomfortable and probably
Song of Solomon is the same way, but like
Oh,
in the romance side,
yeah.
yeah. Like
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry, Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 3. Yeah, yeah.
Will used to read that when he was a KGB onus and be like, "Oh, mama."
He used to hide his copy of Song of Songs between his mattresses.
Yeah, under his bed. Yeah, we all know. These and thous, baby.
Yeah. There's a reason why in the Hebrew Bible tradition, men didn't get to read Song of Songs until they were married. It was not allowed.
I'm still
for
convinced we
single
probably
men.
shouldn't be allowed to because we're just immature and we probably shouldn't be. I don't know why
I'm
God
over
gave
here,
us
like,
that.
I every time I read it, I tell my wife I need an adult. I'm like, I'm not old enough to read this. Like, no. So, but then also, like, when it comes to the no words thing, I like, because we're so inculcated in Western culture that certain words are the taboo, that we have now mistaken that Christians can actually say really horrible things about one another, but because they didn't use a cuss word, suddenly it wasn't that bad. And it's like my brother, for example, if I pull up at a family reunion or anything and I park next to him, I look at him, he's going to look at me, his face is going to go stoic, and he's going to flip me off. I know every single time he's going to flip me off. Now, he's my brother, and it's a brotherly greeting. It's him messing with me, right? It's a joke. Now, the context switches and I'm driving, some guy just tries to run me off the road and flips me off. He actually is meaning the words. He's trying to convey a message of actual cursing. But also, I've been cursed before, quote unquote, by people without using curse words. So I just don't think that curse words are a problem. I think it's actually the intent of the heart and the different contexts. So yeah, that's it. Even Paul uses a word, that scubula. That's pretty. When he says my righteousness is dung, the word scubula is very similar. It's not as harsh as our sh word, but it's more harsh than crap. So it's,
And they all mean poop, dunk. I don't. To me, there's no difference in the words. Just context. It's going to offend somebody.
I don't know. If you want to get a guy's reaction, calling him a poop head or a naughty word is not the same as saying, "I hope the knife slips."
Yeah.
So.
Are we? Yeah, exactly. Which is the worst thing to say, in my opinion. I would,
Yeah, I mean, you can take the Lord's name in vain, but do not dare put that thing in my head. My legs just crossed.
Is this excursion over yet?
You started it.
I just want to say I could
No,
say
Rock started it.
I could say, something to Will and call him something you would consider a curse word and it not mean anything, but then I could dress him down pretty well using all polite langue to be pretty ugly if I wanted to.
Anyway,
Well,
I mean, you text me all the
Bless
time.
your heart, Will.
Stop whining, Wes. You love it. You know it. Like,
Look,
I
I was
think-
abused as a kid. I have really bad boundaries with this. I thrive on abuse. Okay, see, now I'm weaponizing my past.
see, exactly, because you're a horrible human being, and
Facts.
because it's it is. Well, you say that to me all the time, so just quit. So it's the heart of what you say that is more important than the words that you use. Is the point?
Amen.
Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. I don't know what this means. Just to be honest with you.
I'm finding it odd that wrath, they interpret wrath for us as God's wrath, but it's just wrath. Are we talking political wrath? Are we talking like war? Are we talking political persecution, the anger of the nations?
Yeah, it's the wrath of the governing authorities, because that's the avenger who brings wrath. And then in the very next church, is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of the wrath of the avenger of the government if you do evil, but for the sake of your conscience. I don't know what that means. The word conscience has such a broad spectrum of meaning in Romans. Even this doesn't. I mean, you have this word in Romans chapter 2 about the consciences accusing or defending,
or excusing them, right?
Yeah. But the commentators are saying this is not that kind of reference. Some people say you need to go way back into the earliest Greeks, especially with Plato, to understand that conscience would be the idea of the thing that tells you you're doing something bad only. That's the only thing that the conscience does. It's only an accuser internally to this individual. But that goes back to our discussion in Romans chapter 2. Since this is third person singular, but Romans 2 is not, it's talking about accuse and defend. Is that the consciences of multiple people accusing one another, or is that the accuse and defend with eternally? And I go with multiple people pointing back and forth. I'm kind of with Francis Watson on that. But y'all can go watch that whole discussion way back 30 some odd episodes ago. But here, I mean, it seems like the idea of conscience as that accuser, not both accuser and but the idea of you don't just need to not do something for the fear of the wrath, but so that your conscience doesn't accuse you anyway. Whether you get busted by the authorities or not, you want to be a person that your conscience is not weighing upon you with behavior that is out of sync with the governing authorities. But what's y'all's take? Because I don't really know what this means.
So how would you interpret conscience there then in a simple way there for us? How would you view that real fast, Jonathan?
The best I could do would be to go with the idea here that this is talking about the individual's, the singular person's conscience, like my conscience, but my conscience here is
that was my thought on it, but I just wanted to make sure because you kind of went on a tirade. I'm like, am I being clear on it? So sorry, Amber, I didn't mean to cut you off. You go ahead and then I'll.
The commentary's going a tirade on it. That's why I'm just bringing you information, and I'm like, I don't know.
Tirade is what Pritchett's name means in the original language.
Oh, that makes sense. So because that's my whole thought here, where it's like the whole idea of God's wrath doesn't really make a lot of sense because I think again this is about him. This is self-preservation in a sense. Like this is how you survive under imperialism, because God, an avenger, brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Done. Therefore, it's necessary to be in subjection not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of the conscience. Well, whose wrath? Well, it could be the government's wrath if you act out too much. But if it's God's wrath, it'd just be God's wrath revealed against the evil of the government. So don't side with them. Don't be part of the evil of it. But I think it's honestly just the wrath of the government, what it seems like there. And then conscience would be for the sake of your conscience as well. So that way, you can sleep at night because you were a good citizen. And in this honor shame culture that we see in that the first century is taking place in, when, as Paul is writing, there's honor shame culture. Not only could your entire community be killed, but then your entire community that ever exists that might be a Jesus follower would then be shamed. There'd be a shame element. So hey, you go to sleep with a good conscience. You have represented Jesus well and haven't caused any detriment to your community.
And you could probably gloss, and Boss, I want to get your thoughts, but you could probably gloss this similarly to Romans 9:1, where Paul says, I speak the truth in Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience confirms it through the Holy Spirit, or is a co-witness to me, with the Spirit. So conscience probably has an idea of integrity as well, kind of subladen into the idea, a conduct of integrity. So be subjected, and the singular, I don't think the singular matters that much, to be honest. I think singulars often have corporate representation. But boss goes after.
I think, this really gets interesting because this is used in the Septuagint, which is the equivalent to the Hebrew word madah, which is understanding or thought or knowledge. So I think that...
Well, it refers to moral judgment, doesn't it? Like a sort of moral reasoning?
Kind of. It's more... It is, if it's your understanding, if it's your knowledge, this is your Torah. Your Torah is going to be your conscience sake. So this, if you're subjected, so it gets a little, that's where it gets a little funny, because Madah is not necessarily rooted in this knowledge, which is in an understanding kind of way. So knowledge, that word madah, is what comes from the contemplation of Torah. If I understand the word properly, but which there's always a chance that I don't. But
that's interesting because as Nick brought up, if Paul has that kind of Old Testament in the background, we know that in Romans 9:1, which is why I was going to pick on Nick for a second, because he was like, well, I don't know about the individual. Well, but this is the singular and the individual, because Paul brings his conscience alongside with the Holy Spirit as his two witnesses to himself, almost as if the conscience is this other thing, right? He's testifying with multiple witnesses, and he's talking himself, the Holy Spirit, and his conscience is testifying with him and the Holy Spirit. So it seems like that requires
you to read the verb as a singular then. at the beginning of the sentence. And does that appeal
But-
to only an individual, or is that to the community?
Well, it's to the
And in-
community on an individual level because I mean it's the same as Paul, but the idea of conscious there in 9:1 is this idea of it almost functioning in and of itself as something that you can draw upon to be a witness in Paul's mind, because he does it in 9:1 as a co-testifier alongside him and the Holy Spirit. His conscience is like this other thing that testifies. And so that could have bearing here in Romans 13, that your conscience is something that for the sake of this other thing that you have somehow that can testify with you, can be assuaged by your good behavior, but yeah, those are, I don't know, again.
Like Madah, though, it shows up when it does show up, is usually with, well, that's an interesting use of that. But the rest of the time, when it shows up, it's in conjunction with wisdom, with discernment. So it's an interdependent concept, because it always shows up with both
Well,
in Hebrew.
So when you're looking at that in its context, is it treated as its own thing that could be in the same way that wisdom and Torah function as an independent to yourself, even though it's internal to yourself? Does that make sense? It's internal to you, but it is an independent thing, that it functions independently in the same way that you said that wisdom and Torah in that kind of context. Do you have any examples pulled up in its usage?
Yeah, Second Chronicles 1 is where 3 of the occurrences are, and it's wisdom and knowledge all 3 times. Daniel 1:4 is discerning knowledge and understanding, and Daniel 1:17 is God gave them knowledge and intelligence, which that I would probably argue
which
with
word
where
is
they translated
translated?
that.
Which word is translated conscience? in the
Madah is
Hebrew?
translated knowledge in those, but it's always paired with wisdom, which is, I would have to look. Let me pull that word up. Hang on. That is.
This is where we need Joel to tell us about the Septuagint.
Yeah.
Seriously, Joel.
Yeah, Joel.
Where are
What's
you
up,
at,
Joel?
bro?
No, he told us what he was doing tonight, but I can't remember right off the
He's
top. of my
teaching
head.
a
Oh,
class.
that's Hachem. That's interesting. Okay, that's fun. That's a very guttural word there. So
Yeah. Sorry,
anyway,
I'm a child.
I'm ignoring you on purpose.
Well, I mean, the
Oh.
thing is I don't want to just assume that conscious means what we've come to use it
No.
in English to think, oh, my conscience is killing me, kind of thing. Because because the commentaries seem to indicate more, and I think that that's probably correct. So
Yeah,
Real quick, I gotta run. I gotta go pick up my wife and be a dad. But love y'all. This actually saved me a whole host of a bad day. So this was a nice ending. So I
all right,
appreciate
brother.
all the love.
We'll see ya.
so
Bye, Pookie.
Bye bye, Pookie. Love you, boo boo.
That's fun. All right. So Hachem is the wisdom word, skill in technical matters, experience, shrewdness, a prudent woman, can be used politically. Worldly wisdom is referred to in
This is the
First
political
Kings.
context.
So, but this is the pious wisdom of Israel. This is the thing that comes from Torah. So it's looking like it's a balance in here anyway, at least in the Old Testament, where this word is used. It's a balance of knowledge and wisdom, so that learning and the thing that grows from learning, which is all comes out of Torah, basically. So
Yeah. I mean,
it's not very helpful, but there you go.
yeah. Well, we're after more than just glossing it in English here at Biblical Rogues Gallery. We want to know what Paul meant. We don't want to just assume, because I mean, there's a lot of discussion in among the Greeks about the conscience. There's a lot of Hebrew thought behind it, and then there's Paul, and he uses it at least 2 different ways, because I don't think this is being used in the same way as Romans 2. But it could be being used the same way as Romans 9:1, as this independent thing that for the sake of whatever that is that you can draw upon to testify along with yourself and the Holy Spirit that's internal to you as this thing, you need for the sake of that, it is necessary to be in subjection to these governing authorities ordained by God. So, but sure, at the most basic level, as Christians, I mean, but this can't merely just be the Holy Spirit, unless because the Holy Spirit is going to act upon your conscience to convict you that you shouldn't have stole the candy bar, Will, when you were at the Metro gas station.
You don't know me.
I know you would never feel bad. You've already seared your conscience. See, that's another. If we broaden this to Paul's larger corpus, conscience comes up, with a seared conscience and all that kind of thing. You got to make sure you know what he's talking about. But now here comes every tax collector and CPA's favorite verse. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers or publicans are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. That he finishes off with kind of a general pay to all what is due them. He comes back to tax, to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, respect to respect, and honor to whom honor. Now, as I mentioned at the top, there was a lot of taxation and tolling going on in Rome specifically, but throughout the empire, but specifically in Rome itself during this time that Tacitus talks about, and Suetonius talks about it as well. And so there was this idea that, again, being in a new creation in Christ, and this not part of this age's kingdom, but a part of a kingdom to come, why bother with these kind of things? And Paul seems to think that this, or let me say this: commentaries seem to think that if you line up the time frame, that it's very, very likely, like 99% likely, that the heavy taxation that was fostering a lot of grumbling and a lot of I don't want to say it fostered insurrections, but a lot of that revolutionary tendencies were coming about because of the frustrations of the heavy taxing and tolling, that Christians might want to opt out of that. And Paul saying no. Certainly he would be familiar with Jesus is saying, he doesn't quote it here about render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and and that's in the context of paying taxes. So it seems like he's emphasizing this twice about paying taxes. He brings up paying taxes because he didn't want them to not pay taxes, and this idea that you can get away with that because as much as I wish Jesus had given us like permission to cheat on our taxes, Jesus addresses this, and so does Paul. Pay your taxes.
You know what would be better is if he actually forbade it, and then we could actually say we have a religious exemption and we have the freedom of religion here in the U.S. It could just have been so perfect.
It would have been great, but here's why he didn't do it. And I think Seneca, was mentioning this about when they were deliberating over whether or not to ease up the taxation and the tolling through the city, it was like, yeah, but you've got to finance your empire. And so if you do that, you have to do it selectively, like what we do with our tax cuts, but then give the loopholes to the people who can afford the loopholes. But anyway, that was kind of Seneca's advice here, because you want to make the people happy, but you don't want to take a huge hit to your treasury, right? Because Nero was trying at this point in time to be returning to a more golden age of Augustus rather than the chaos of like more contemporaries like his uncle Claudius or adopted dad Claudius. So it's like you've got this idea here, but Paul says no, and the reason why Jesus probably believes this and Paul believes this is how much resentment would you have if the church community? Think about apologetics and atheist discussions. How many atheists talk about they don't want the church to have tax exemption status, right? You hear that all the time. it already creates resentment for religious organizations and certain private organizations to have tax exemption. And so, I mean, we see that in our day. I mean, thank goodness that, some people think that it's okay for, exercise, free exercise thereof. You can read into, there's no constraints, governmental constraints, including taxation, insofar as you follow certain rules under the 503c, even though there's a debate whether or not churches need to even be a 501c, but not about tax law.
C3.
Yeah, whatever. My wife is the one who knows this stuff, not me. She's the accountant. Like literally, like that was her thing. But whether or not you need a 501c or not for churches are exempt from taxes, and it does create a discontent for a lot of people against Christianity because of that very reason. And it seems to me that I'm just using that as an example for why Paul might insist that if you believe you belong in it, you're still on this side of the eschaton, even though it's the already not yet that Junior was talking about. You do this so that you don't become part of the rabble rousers, and that you stay, you keep the reputation of the church honorable. Now, the law in our context says, hey, we get to be tax exempt for churches. So, I can't do nothing about it. Change the law, but they'll never happen. You'll never get that in Congress. But in Paul's day, that was not an option, right? So, pay your taxes. And then he gives this more, or where he repeats it, these are the deacons of God. Yay. I mean, he's going overboard to sell these people who work for the state that want to always constantly haggle you for your money. But you got to do it. And not only do you got to pay your taxes, but you should show respect to whom respect is due. Customs, you follow the customs where the customs are due. You respect those, and you show honor to those who honor is due. And the reason why I don't like this passage, just in my flesh, is because I don't like the idea of respecting offices, like respect the robe of the judge, respect the office of the president, respect the uniform of, my son is a police officer, but he's the first to tell you there's a lot of corruption in police, but yet Paul's idea here is where it's due. He's talking about the establishment of these authorities, he's not talking about individually. Your disposition, your natural, your spirit-filled angle towards this is to give the honor, respect, and customs to all that have it coming who are in those positions of authority. And there's a part of me that doesn't like that, but it seems like it's tough. I've got to, it's like Paul says, pray for kings and everyone in authority. He doesn't say you can't pray imprecatory prayers when you do that, but he does tell you to do that. And sometimes you may not be inclined to pray for those people, except imprecatory prayers. But that wasn't the sense of the text. He was wanting pray for everyone, kings and people in authority, for a reason. So it seems like more positive prayers towards that. So I have a hard time, even if I've carved out exceptions all throughout tonight's broadcast. There are still things that there's a part of me that doesn't like, but I have to suck it up, right? So I don't know. What do you think about paying? How much do you love paying taxes and respecting all these people who by position are entitled to some respect just by occupying a position?
Well, my wife and I, so when some people get lost, they play Marco Polo, like when they're trying to find each other, like Marco Polo. Well, this should tell you about where I stand on the issue. If we're in the superstore and I lose her, which happens commonly, she's 4'10", so she disappears behind a clothing rack. All right, like it doesn't take much. So instead, we play a game at Walmart and stuff where I just go taxation, and my wife has to respond with is theft.
Nice. Nice.
And I'm not even kidding. We do that, and it's amazing the amount of head turns you get. It's hilarious. So, but
I love it.
But I am not a big fan, and it's mainly because I understand that taxes can be necessary, right? We do need military and stuff as a nation, blah blah blah. Okay, whatever. I can get behind some of that, but here, my biggest issue is the amount of taxation and how often our dollar gets taxed You know, we have the income tax, and then you get the sales tax. So you're taxing the dollars that you've already taxed, and all the other wonderful things. So that's my issue. But I do think, yeah, pay to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, respect to whom respect, honor to whom honor. So I think I do see, like, you know, okay, an officer might pull you over. Well, we all know there's good cops and bad cops. Well, you know, I should honor him in his position. I don't have to agree with the reason to be pulled over. It happened to me recently where I got a ticket because I was driving, minding my own business. They pulled me over, and I thought to myself, what the heck did I do? I was doing everything right. Well, my plate was expired, but they didn't ever send me any paperwork about my plate. And it had to be renewed while I was like crippled and laid up with a broken leg. So I never got paperwork, and I was crippled at the time, but I still got the ticket, which is super, super, super duper lame because the government didn't even like send you the reminder, but they can still penalize you. Now, I honored the officer because it's not his fault that the government didn't send it. And even the officer's like, is this your first year here? I was like, yeah. It's like for whatever reason, a lot of times the first year people do not get their paperwork. But here's your ticket. And I was like, what? So, but still showing him honor because he is in a position of governmental authority, technically over me as a citizen. And now I don't have to like it, but I do have to suck it up and deal with it. He was nice.
Yeah, because this seems like general wisdom that what Paul, again, going back to the wisdom reading of this. Don't bring shame upon the community, and this just makes your life easier. That's what I'm reading. This is how you survive imperial life. This just makes your life easier by following these precepts. If you don't mouth off at the cop, he doesn't pull you out of the car and take you down to the county jail for a night to let you, think about it for a while. You just pay your ticket and you go. Or whatever, but this advice is general wisdom to me, saying you should do these things. Number one, not to bring shame upon God and the servants that He has put into place, but it just makes your life easier. Keep your head down, pay your taxes, show respect to the officers that pull you over, or whatever. To your governor, our governor's terrible. I am now. I used to be. Buckshin was in my old office, directly below me, and now that we've moved offices, Messner, our the guy who replaced our horrible Republican representative, who didn't run for re-election, thank goodness. I used to leave nasty Post-it notes on his office door, and of course he's never in town. He's always in D.C. and doesn't care about his constituent. So his poor lady, whoever worked the office, got the nasty Post-it notes. I haven't written any, but now I just have to walk across the hall because now I'm directly across the hall from our state representative. Now that we've moved from the 13th floor to the 12th, and so I will respect to who is, but I will show honor to him unless he doesn't act honorably, because Paul could have never envisioned a democracy or a representative republic where, yes, there was a Senate at one time and their power became irrelevant and all of that back in, the Greco-Roman times. But what we have here is we do have within the law of the way that America is governed, we actually have more flexibility in our context to do more politically than Christians would have in the Roman Empire. So you have to read this in light of what it means to be in an empire. Use wisdom to see, well, what are my obligations as somebody who lives in a Western democracy or representative republic? And as we live in a representative republic, not only am I one of the 500 and some odd followers of Representative Mesmer, but if he turns out to be he's the type of Republican that in Arkansas we call them Democrats. So if Mesner turns out to be another Buckshin, I don't see anything, as long as I'm not too nasty and using coarse language, coarse joking on the Post-it note, the Post-it notes will continue because he just moved into the last guy's office. So the good news is here in our political context, we have more of a say in how we're governed because we elect the people that represent us. And I did vote for Mesmer, but I voted for Buckshin, and he was awful. And as I always say on this program, If you give somebody your vote and they win, you become their harshest critic. You don't be their biggest. Don't be a fan of your politicians you vote for. Be their harshest critic because you put them in power, and they better not stray from what you wanted them to represent you on. That's how I see that. I'll shut up now. Amber, you're biting your pen, but do you have anything to add to that?
I'm just wondering at this point, listening to the two of you, if we even in our modern context can even understand what Paul is talking about. Americans are so in love with their independence and their rights if they can even get their heads around what Paul's talking about.
Well, where people had a lot less than they do now, reading the literal reading is ridiculous. It's even more ridiculous the less rights you have for Paul to take this literal reading. Again, given what Paul said in Romans, given what Paul has recorded to say by Luke in Acts and other biblical apostles, what they've said about obeying God rather than man, the whole story of the Old Testament, nonviolent resistance when necessary. That being in Paul's mind as well. The literal reading of this, like the abject absolutist reading of this, just doesn't do anything for me. But I would say that you have, in Paul's context, you have more pressure to follow this in a more absolute sense than we do, and it wasn't even absolute for him. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I still think that I disagree with you on this one. And not that I'm saying it's a literal reading. I'm just saying that our American brains don't get the ancient Near Eastern mind that's going on here. It's not a context that we have easily. It takes a lot of work for us to get there. So I don't know that we can, without a lot of extra work, like I'm skeptical that this is one of those concepts that comes easily to the American context, Western, logical, literal, left-brained, obsessioned mind.
Well, but
I'm saying.
I do think if you do that work, and I think we've done a lot of good work. For the background, I think if you do that, you can draw the right principles. But but what I was saying is, I think that the reality was more harsh for Paul's audience than it would be for us. And if it wasn't even literal for Paul's audience, or not literal, but absolute for Paul's audience, who had more to fear from their government than I think, well, at least as of now, who knows how it'll go in the future. But as of now, I think in our day, the principles, I think we actually have more freedom in the non-absolutist reading of this than even Paul's audience did. And it became more pertinent to Paul's original audience than it really would be for us today. For the very survival reasons that Will was talking about, if nothing else. And to not bring shame on the community, which we still have to watch out for in our context.
Yeah, still not convinced, but yep.
Okay. Well, I'm doing the best I can. If Nick was here, he would fix it because he likes Paul, and I wish Paul never wrote this. I wish this was an interpolation, because Christians have become very comfortable saying, the woman at the well story in John, that's an interpolation. So it's the later ending of Mark. I wish I could take that same attitude to this passage, but I can't, right? There's not enough evidence there to take it that way. So we have to do something with this.
Well,
But
I do think that, to that point of Amber's, I do think I think we can intellectually understand what he's kind of driving at. I do think that's a thing. Like, obviously, we can look at the context and understand, but fully living it and realizing it, I think it's a whole nother challenge, because it's a thing when you're in the Western mind, we think continually in the fact that we live in a free democratic republic, and constitutional republic at that. So I don't know, I think I see what Amber's trying to say there, but I do think that there is a difference between how that would be applied to the modern day because that was under imperialism where they could just execute you off the cuff.
Yeah,
But-
well, absolutely. If you
and-
would read this differently, even if you did all of the same background readings that we've done tonight, talk about whatever else. If we did all of that, go through the Old Testament, you would still take a different lens of your own personal context if you lived in a Muslim nation or in China or something like that and would read this. So I'm with you on that, Amber. Like if we were in China trying to make sense of this passage, we would have to wrestle with this text a lot more than we do here in the United States.
And this is one of the things that some people, sorry, Amber, I didn't mean to cut you off. You look like you're going to say something.
Well, her mic's muted.
Well, I'm just going to say this because I can. I'm going to say that I think Paul sitting here listening to Pritchett complain about the IRS coming for his chickens and Will's whining about the government not sending him the paperwork in the mail so that he doesn't get a ticket. He's going to look at both of you and go, how dumb are you? Like, seriously, I don't think that is what he's got in mind at all. I think that's just bad take. That's all I have to say about that.
I don't think that's what Paul has in mind at all, but I think that was fun analogies, fun rabbit.
Yeah. I'm talking about my way of I try to show honor. Like he pulled me over, and even when he gave me a text, it's like a ticket. I was like, all right, thank you, officer. Like trying to show him honor, and like my best friend's a cop, and he's a government shill. I give him crap for it all the time. But no, one of the things as well, like that we have to consider is that since we live in a constitutional republic, that means we have representatives. And so I think representatives are a bit different than what he was dealing with, which is why it's okay to call your representative and go, hey, you're not representing your people very well. This is your job.
Yeah,
I need you to
notice
do
that,
your job.
Yeah, notice that our representatives we can treat worse than the unelected people like police officers and other people like that, right? It's like the people who directly affect your life. You can mouth off to your mayor, but you can't mouth off to the police officer.
Well, that's actually like, here's what's unique about our governmental structure is that it is actually supposed to be the people that have the power through the representative and various things. So actually us engaging that way is us actually engaging in the governmental systems the way we're supposed to and engaging in the government that's set up. So part of doing the honor is to honor the systems that are in place and therefore make your voice heard when you're able and when you need to. So that is also something to keep in mind for the Americans out there who might be wrestling with some of this and how it works. I think some Americans just take a, well, it doesn't matter approach because I'm part of the kingdom of God, which I could respect, but also this is the governmental system in place. That's why we vote and those things. And, that's same thing. Like whenever I vote, like whenever you're voting for a president, one of the things you always end up hearing from Christians, especially like Christian nationalist types who are either blue or red, because there is nationalism on both sides in Christianity. Like you'll see it. They'll start pulling out all the resume of all the people wrong on the blue side or all the things wrong on the red side and start saying how this person doesn't live a Christian life. And in my mind, I'm like, well, I'm not a Christian nationalist. It doesn't really matter to me if the person lives a Christian life. My question is, can they do the job and run my country well? That's my question. And are they going to help people? And so those are the sorts of things. And now when I vote or when I complain, that is my right and also part of how our government system works within, culturally speaking. So I think that's where also Amber's point is, where because we live in that part where civilians actually engage in that way, and that's part of how our government works, why it's so hard for Westerners to even understand this idea of an empire that is the unquestionable authority that can literally do it with you whatever you want. Because we hear that and we go, well, time for another tea party. That's our whole thing. We're like, all right, I guess we'll overthrow the government and establish a new one. That's the American vision, but that wasn't the case for them back then.
Exactly.
Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. All right.
Yeah,
I want
exactly.
to make sure
Yes.
I'm making sense.
I like it. Amber, any closing thoughts before we move into the final section?
I think it's just, this is one of those things where it's important to always get outside of your own head and your own context when you're reading this stuff, because we don't, there's always going to be somebody who's going to read this section and go, well, the FDA is coming for my chickens, I can shoot people. Like, that's not what Paul is saying here. So sometimes you have to state the obvious because people
Called
need
out.
called out for the obvious. Yes, that's all I'm
What,
saying.
you really
In
think
a
so?
bigger perspective.
You think somebody out there is going to think I was not being facetious?
This is the internet.
you
You
met
never
you?
underestimate people's stupidity.
I know.
Never underestimate people's
Braxton
stupidity. on
tells
the
me that
internet.
stuff all the time too. They might think you're serious. There's going to be someone who English is not their first language, and then they're going to take you. This is the whole world's
There's
listening.
people who have English as their first language who'll take you seriously.
Yeah. Look,
Well, and,
another
you could
favorite.
even say the same thing about Will's comment. Like, oh, the government didn't mail me my thing for my license plate. I'm going to go invade my senator's office and sit there in a stakeout until he gets me my paper. That's not what Paul is saying. But sometimes you have to state the obvious for the internet idiots. That's all I'm saying.
One of my favorite people on Twix, Mind Warden, says, "I only take Pritchett seriously." Dude, that you should and follow everything I say. It'll go well.
Pope Pritchett the Prime.
Next week, Amber will be happy because we'll be getting into Leviticus, and she'll be able to tell us everything that we need to know how to get this passage right, because she likes Leviticus and thinks that we should only read Leviticus. Leviticus is more important than Romans.
Actually, Deuteronomy is more important than Romans.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
We have a super chat from Sparky Schultz. Tip for Amber. But Amber's channel is not monetized.
Right. So
Well,
I
this-
sent him to Will's channel to go do his super chat because he can't do it on my channel because I'm not monetized, and he felt bad. So I sent him to Will's channel to super
Instead
chat
of
over
Trinity
there.
Radio. I see how you are.
That's
Well,
exactly
Sparky,
how.
what says as a tip for Amber, I'll talk to Amber. We have each other's number. I'll find a way to forward her the $10.
No,
So-
no. Save it for when she gets here to Evansville. Her and Doug are coming to Evansville. So when they get to
know,
Evansville.
but it doesn't mean I can't send her $10.
Dave.
Don't tell me what to do.
See, I would have
Dave,
saved it and
correct
handed
me,
you
Pritchett.
cash. I would have handed you cash
Dave,
because
Dave,
if
not
you
Doug.
Doug, golly.
yeah, where'd you get Doug? Like, no one's named Doug. Sorry for anyone who's named Doug, but no one's named Doug.
Sorry, Dave.
Doug's that
I'm sorry.
cringy,
Sorry.
like
I'm
90s
old.
cartoon.
I'm old. My excuse. I'm sorry, Dave. Dave. Amber's better half, Dave. I'm sorry. I will never call him Doug. I don't know where I got Doug
No,
from.
no. He's not her better half. Amber's awesome. It's gonna be hard to top that.
I bet you Dave won't tell me I'm wrong every 5 minutes.
That's true. Dave will not. He's too nice
So
for that.
better half, like I said, and he preferred the cash instead of the cut that YouTube's going to take, and then whatever PayPal takes when I'd have handed you $10. You did it on my channel.
Oh my gosh, I'm just
Dave's
send-
gonna take my side on this too. He's gonna say, "See, he knows."
I'm just gonna send
No,
Amber $10.
'cause-
Stop your
Nope.
bickering, you old man.
No,
Oh, good
We
grief.
are going to get coffee when I get there, and that's when I get my $10. That's what
Coffee.
we're doing.
Oh, that's true.
Yes.
Oh no, we have a great donut shop with pretty good coffee here.
Yeah.
But there's honeymoon or parlor. I don't know which one. But
Parlor.
either way,
Parlor, it's right.
Uh,
It's right around the corner from here. Anyway, next week we're gonna be. Are we doing this next week? Or we're still on next week, correct?
I don't know what I'm doing, dude. I make this up as I go. I have a newborn. You kidding me?
I'll be
Like,
here next week, and we'll get into Deuteronomy, but probably Leviticus, because Leviticus is actually quoted here in verse 9, and all that more stuff about love. You know, that love your neighbor as yourself business. So we'll get into that. Anyone want to shout out anything before we get into the what do you do with this passage?
What do you mean? Like,
What's
shout
coming
out
up?
what? Oh,
Whatever.
okay. Yeah, I'm starting a Torah series that's coming out starting next week.
On Faith and
On my channel, on When Deep Calls Deep.
Okay, cool.
Ooh, that's fun. I
Yeah.
have currently I'm working through my series on theology of the body. It's basically what I've been teaching the students here, but re-geared for a YouTube channel. And my frustration is this: the views on episode 1 suck. But what people don't realize is that half the crap with the trans nonsense and all the stuff that people are dealing with, like seeing LGBTQ rise up, the use of pornography, all those things are actually like theology of the body is actually your answer to that problem, because Christians, though, tend to suck at talking about the theology of the body, because we'd actually just prefer to tell kids don't look at porn, don't have sex until you're married. I think that somehow solves the problem, as opposed to giving them really equipped reasons as to why that is the case. So check it out. The next episode is dropping publicly. It's available for members only right now. It is actually dropping this week. And when it drops, you can watch that, but it is definitely important that we do that. So that is what I'm focusing on. And then I want to do, I think, a series after my theology of the body. I think I want to go actually through Calvinism properly instead of taking pot shots, and actually going through the tulip and talk about salvation by allegiance and actually like what grace really was, honor, shame culture, all that, and kind of how that's the silver bullet. I think that shoots Calvinism right in the kneecaps. So anyway.
Are you going to be? You invited me onto that series, I think.
Oh well, no, ours could just be adjacent to the series. You and I are doing that. We're going to talk about the issue of anti-Semitism and absolute racism and horrific things.
No. That you wanted me to talk about fitness stuff on the theology of the body.
Oh yeah, with theology, but yes, absolutely, yep, that as well.
And,
but we're also going to talk about the Calvinist racism stuff.
Oh yeah, we're definitely going to do that, and we need to talk about. What you need to talk about is you need to talk about body maps in the ancient Near East, because that's very important, because they had maps for everything. And I don't mean map like draw like the state map, like how they understood the body. Maps, just the body map is what they. Very interesting stuff. I have a couple of slides on it. You don't have to have me on.
When I have you on to talk about it, you can talk about that.
Okay, yeah, and we've got Leighton Flowers coming up Friday to finish, or not finish, because we got Leighton Flowers coming up Friday to talk about the responses to his questions on our live stream. And then we have Tim Stratton after that to talk about his questions. And then I will be addressing the answers to my questions from the 20 questions from Calvinism stuff. So tune in Friday for Leighton Flowers. All right. So, Wes, you're preaching, teaching this class to youth group. Whatever. What are your big points on that? How do you, if you were to take this passage and teach it, what would you do with it?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is I would start off with an introduction that actually kind of sets the stage for a minute. I would explain some of the things about the culture like we discussed, honor, shame culture, what it was to live under empire. What is empire? What is the oppression of the empire? Especially with Western kids, I don't think in America, I don't think they would fully understand it. So I'd want to try to paint the picture of what that means. And so that way you got that set up. But then also I think I would love, if I was actually teaching the students, I think I'd just read verses 1-7, have the kids look at it for a minute, and then ask the kids, what does it mean? And see what they say, because I think a lot of kids might actually take it hyper literally, because it is a good lesson in hermeneutics. And I'd point that out. Then I'd set it up with the intro. But then I think what I would do is I would really hone in on the idea of, hey, therefore, God sets up authorities. All right, how do you navigate the earthly authorities when they're corrupt? And then honestly, turn it into a lesson probably of not just being a model citizen, but being of a proper light and living peaceably with all men as much as you can. But in the end, obey God rather than man. I think I would still take that angle at the end, because you're honoring the kingship of Christ. Because if you're just doing those particular verses, I think you'd struggle with having a really strong spiritual application besides honoring people. And I think you go through all that and then end on, but the kingship of Christ. That would be me. But
you're muted.
Yeah, I have nothing really that I would add to that, except I would bring it into what I talked about. I don't know, either the last episode or the episode before last, where first set it up. Then I would talk about that God has ordained authorities, and that there are ways to subvert authorities and oppose them. But the main thrust of this is exactly what Peter was talking about in chapter 3 about always be ready to give a defense. It's all about not bringing shame upon the community of Christ. And it's about, your good behavior, which is what he says. which the whole go watch that episode at the end, where chapter 3 is not about Kalam cosmological arguments. It's about being good and doing good. And what Paul's trying to aim at here is, in the context of Rome, it's not going to always be, this is not absolute, but generally speaking, if you do this, you can use it to your advantage to bring honor to the Christian community. That was also the apologetics of the first apologists in the second century, all the way through Augustine, saying, look, we're your best citizens. Why would you want to persecute us? We are the ones that are doing the most honorable thing in our communities that even you pagans think is laudable. So, you don't have to be absolute with this, and you can go through that. But the main thing I want to stress is this is your apologetic to the watching world. Don't bring shame upon Christ. Bring honor upon Christ and Christ's people so that you can accomplish the gospel mission just like Paul wants to accomplish in Spain. So there you go. See, it takes me a lot less time than it used to to summarize. So, folks, we appreciate you having taken time out to watch this broadcast. We're here most Monday nights unless something comes up, and we hope that you go back if you're new to the series and watch all the prior episodes. This is episode number 38, so there's 37 other things, and we're only in chapter 13. We'll finish up the next broadcast, and we appreciate you being here. And with that, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio, when Deep Calls Deep, and whatever church split, whatever Will's channel's called. See you guys. Thanks. God bless.